One man, one word, 7 billion lives. October 27th, 1962, somewhere in the Caribbean Sea, 300 feet below the surface, 3 Soviet officers are screaming at each other inside a nuclear submarine that's literally cooking them alive. The temperature is 140 degrees. They haven't had contact with Moscow in days. American destroyers are dropping depth charges all around them, and the captain is ordering them to launch a nuclear torpedo that will kill millions and start World War III. 2 officers say yes. 1 says no. That single no is the only reason you're alive right now to hear this story. His name was Vasili Arkhipov, and for 50 years, almost nobody knew he existed. Before we dive in, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these forgotten stories that changed the world. And subscribe because your support keeps them alive. Now let me tell you about the day the world should have ended. October 27th, 1962 is known to historians as Black Saturday. But that sanitized name doesn't capture what it really was. The day humanity stood at the absolute edge of extinction and somehow didn't fall in. Most people know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You probably learned about it in school. Soviet missiles in Cuba, Kennedy and Khrushchev in a standoff, 13 days of tension. Crisis resolved, moving on. But here's what they didn't tell you. While Kennedy and Khrushchev were playing chess with the world, the actual trigger for nuclear war was in the hands of 3 men trapped in a submarine who thought the war had already started. Let me paint you the picture of what the world looked like that day. In Washington, D.C., President Kennedy's advisors are pressuring him to launch a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Some are actively advocating for a first-strike nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have calculated acceptable losses. 140 million dead Americans in a nuclear exchange is considered manageable if it means destroying the communist threat. In Moscow, Khrushchev is terrified. He knows the Americans have more nukes, better delivery systems, and forward bases surrounding the Soviet Union. He's made a desperate gamble putting missiles in Cuba to level the playing field. And now that gamble is collapsing around him. In Cuba, Fidel Castro is writing letters to Khrushchev, practically begging him to launch the nukes first. He's willing to sacrifice Cuba and himself if it means taking down American imperialism. He's convinced the invasion is coming any moment. And in the Caribbean Sea, 4 Soviet submarines are running a blockade that the U.S. Navy has been ordered to enforce at all costs. One of those submarines is called B-59, and it's carrying a secret that neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev fully understood: a nuclear torpedo with a 15-kiloton warhead. That's roughly the same yield as the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The submarine commanders were given permission to use these weapons if certain conditions were met. They didn't need to ask Moscow. They had authorization. 3 men had the authority to launch. If all 3 agreed, they could start a nuclear war independently of either government. Nobody in the American fleet dropping depth charges on them knew this. Nobody in the Kennedy administration knew this. And this is where Vasili Arkhipov enters the story. But before we get to that submarine, you need to understand how the world got to this point. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of 17 years of escalating madness. When World War II ended in 1945, there was a brief moment when people thought, maybe, just maybe, we'd learned our lesson about total war. The devastation was so complete, the horror so absolute, that surely humanity would choose a different path. That optimism lasted 5 minutes. By 1949, the Soviet Union had the bomb. By 1952, both sides had hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful. By 1962, the United States had over 27,000 nuclear weapons. The Soviets had about 3,300. Think about those numbers for a second. 27,000 nuclear weapons. The combined explosive power was enough to destroy every major city on Earth multiple times over. Enough to plunge the planet into nuclear winter. Enough to potentially end human civilization. And here's the truly insane part. Both sides had developed war plans for actually using these things. The US had something called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, or SIOP. It was a nuclear war playbook that called for launching thousands of warheads at over 1,000 targets in the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe. The plan didn't just target military bases. It targeted cities, industrial centers, transportation hubs. The goal was total annihilation of the enemy's ability to function as a society. Estimated deaths from PSYOP: 285 million in the Soviet Union and China alone. That's before you count the deaths in Europe from fallout or the global deaths from nuclear winter. The Soviets had similar plans for the United States. Both sides knew these plans existed. Both sides knew that launching first was strategically preferable to launching second. Both sides were constantly calculating whether the other side might be preparing to strike. This is the world Vasili Arkhipov was living in. A world where rational human beings had created a system practically designed to end humanity by accident. So why Cuba? What made this island 90 miles from Florida the flashpoint for potential extinction? In April 1961, the CIA launched the Bay of Pigs. Cuban exiles trained by American forces tried to overthrow Castro. It was a spectacular failure. Castro survived, but now he was absolutely convinced the Americans would try again. And next time, they'd use regular military forces. He was right to worry. The Kennedy administration was obsessed with getting rid of Castro. They had Operation Mongoose, a program of sabotage and assassination attempts. They were planning another invasion. Khrushchev saw an opportunity. If he could put medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, suddenly the strategic balance would shift dramatically. American cities would be in range. The US would have minutes of warning instead of hours. It would be the same situation the Soviets lived with every day, with American missiles in Turkey pointed at them. So in the summer of 1962, the Soviets began Operation Anadir, a secret deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba. And it almost worked. By October, there were already nuclear warheads on the island. R-12 missiles with 1 megaton warhead, that's 50 times more powerful than Hiroshima. Launch time, 15 minutes. Flight time to Washington, D.C., 13 minutes. But on October 14th, an American U-2 spy plane took photographs that revealed the missile sites. Kennedy was briefed on October 16th, and suddenly the world's most powerful nation realized it had nuclear weapons pointed at its head from 90 miles away. Kennedy formed the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, to handle the crisis. The meetings were secretly recorded, and when those tapes were finally released, they revealed just how close we came to nuclear war multiple times. Some of Kennedy's advisors were pushing hard for immediate military action. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff, called for massive airstrikes followed by a full invasion. He thought Kennedy was weak for even considering a blockade. LeMay had run the firebombing campaign against Japan in World War II. He'd burned entire cities. He had no qualms about starting a war that would kill millions. But Kennedy chose a naval quarantine instead. On October 22nd, he went on television and told the American people about the missiles. He announced that the Navy would intercept any ships carrying offensive weapons to Cuba. And he made it clear, any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union, requiring a full retaliatory response. The Navy established a quarantine line 500 miles from Cuba. Soviet ships carrying missile components were already en route. If they crossed that line, American ships were ordered to stop them by any means necessary. But here's what nobody knew. 4 Soviet submarines were already in the Caribbean, assigned to protect those cargo ships. And each submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. Submarine B-59 had left its base in the Kola Peninsula on October 1st, before the crisis even began. It was supposed to be a routine deployment to the Soviet base in Cuba. By the time they realized the world was on the brink of war, they were already in the operational area, surrounded by American warships. And they were completely cut off from communication with Moscow. Let me tell you what it was like inside submarine B-59, because you need to understand the conditions these men were making life-or-death decisions in. Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines were diesel-electric boats. They weren't nuclear-powered, like American subs. They needed to surface regularly to run their diesel engines and recharge their batteries. Underwater, they were slow, and the air got scale fast. B-59 was 300 feet long and carried a crew of 78 men. It was designed for the cold waters of the North Atlantic. It was not designed for the Caribbean Sea in October. The temperature inside was between 100 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Men were fainting from heat exhaustion. CO2 levels were climbing to dangerous concentrations. The air was thick and foul. Crew members were developing heat rash and fungal infections. Some were hallucinating. They'd been submerged for days, running on battery power to avoid detection. The batteries were nearly dead. The air scrubbers were failing. They had no communication with Moscow. Their radio antenna had to be above water to receive messages. And they couldn't surface without being detected. And then the depth charges started. American destroyers had located B-59 using sonar. They began dropping what the Navy called practice depth charges. Small explosives meant to signal the submarine to surface. The charges were set to explode far enough away not to damage the submarine, just scare it. But here's what nobody knew. Nobody told the Soviet submarine this. From inside B-59, those explosions sounded like attacks, like the war had started, like American destroyers were trying to sink them. The submarine's captain was Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky. He was 42 years old, a veteran submarine commander with a reputation for being aggressive and proud. He'd been underwater for days, in hellish conditions, cut off from command, with no idea what was happening in the world above. For all he knew, World War III had started. The missiles in Cuba had been discovered, the Americans had attacked, and his submarine was under assault. He made a decision. The political officer was Ivan Simonovich Maslenikov. His job was to ensure political loyalty and correct ideological thinking. In the Soviet system, the political officer had significant power. He could overrule military decisions if he thought they violated party doctrine. Maslenikov agreed with Savitsky. If they were under attack, if the war had started, they had a duty to fight back. Soviet doctrine was clear. If attacked, defend yourself. If nuclear war had begun, use your weapons to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. Both men agreed. Prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch. But there was a third officer who had to consent. His name was Vasili Alexandrovich Arkhipov. He was 36 years old, second in command of the submarine. And on this particular mission, he was also the flotilla commander, the senior officer overseeing all 4 submarines. Because of his dual role, Soviet protocol required his consent for any nuclear launch. 2 officers were saying yes. Arkhipov had to decide. If he agreed, a nuclear torpedo would be launched at the American fleet. It would kill thousands of sailors instantly, it would vaporize multiple warships, and it would absolutely unquestionably start a nuclear war that would kill hundreds of millions. The pressure in that submarine must have been unbearable. Your captain is ordering a strike, the political officer agrees, the crew thinks you're under attack, you're exhausted, dehydrated, scared. Every instinct says, fight back, defend yourself, follow orders. And Vasili Arkhipov said no. But here's the thing you need to understand. This wasn't the first time Arkhipov had faced a potential nuclear disaster. And his previous experience probably saved the world. 1 year earlier, in July 1961, Arkhipov was the executive officer on submarine K-19. It was a brand new Soviet nuclear submarine, their first operational ballistic missile sub. It was supposed to demonstrate Soviet naval power. On July 4th, during a training exercise in the North Atlantic, the K-19's nuclear reactor cooling system failed. The reactor core was approaching meltdown. If it exploded, it would kill the entire crew and potentially cause a nuclear detonation that would trigger American retaliation. The captain was Nikita Zateyev. He and Arkhipov had to make impossible decisions. They needed to fix the cooling system, but the radiation levels in the reactor compartment were lethal. Anyone who entered would die. They asked for volunteers. 8 crew members went into the reactor compartment to jury-rig a new cooling system using whatever materials they could find. They were exposed to massive doses of radiation, over 10,000 roentgens. They worked until they collapsed. Some were vomiting blood, their skin was burning, but they got the cooling system working. The reactor was brought under control. The submarine limped to a nearby Soviet base. All 8 men who entered the reactor compartment died within a month. More crew members died over the following years from radiation-related illnesses. The official Soviet count was 22 deaths. Some sources suggest more. Arkhipov survived because, as executive officer, he stayed at his post coordinating the repair efforts. But he'd witnessed the sacrifice. He'd seen men die to prevent a nuclear catastrophe. The Soviet government covered it up. The families of the dead were told it was classified. The crew of K-19 was sworn to secrecy. Arkhipov couldn't even tell his own family what he'd been through. But he learned something crucial. When you're in a crisis situation, with limited information and immense pressure, the instinct to do something dramatic and immediate can lead to catastrophe. Sometimes the hardest choice is the right one. Sometimes saying no requires more courage than saying yes. Exactly 1 year and 3 months later, that lesson would save the world. Inside B-59, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Captain Savitsky was furious. In some accounts of that day, he was shouting, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." The crew was preparing the nuclear torpedo. It was a Type 53 torpedo with a 10-kiloton warhead. Accounts vary on the exact yield. Some sources say 15 kilotons. Either way, it was a city-killer weapon. The target would be the USS Randolph, an aircraft carrier, and the destroyers surrounding B-59. Detonating a nuclear weapon that close would vaporize the submarine, too. Everyone knew that. They were preparing for a suicide mission. This was acceptable to Savitsky. Better to die fighting than to be captured. Better to inflict damage on the enemy than to surface in shame. Maslenikov agreed. This was ideological warfare. If the war had started, they had a duty to strike back. But Arkhipov was thinking clearly, despite the heat, despite the fear, despite the pressure. He asked questions. What actual evidence do we have that war has started? Have we received any communications ordering us to attack? Are we sure those depth charges are meant to sink us, or could they be warning signals? He argued, if we launch this torpedo, we guarantee nuclear war. If we surface, we might find out this is all a misunderstanding. If Moscow wanted us to launch, they would have sent explicit orders. The argument inside that submarine lasted hours. Some crew members thought Arkhipov was a coward. Some thought he was a traitor. The heat was unbearable. The air was poison. Men were at their breaking point. But Arkhipov wouldn't budge. He outranked Savitsky because of his flotilla commander status. He had the authority to overrule the captain. But Soviet submarine tradition gave the captain enormous power. Arkhipov couldn't just order Savitsky to stand down. He had to convince him. And somehow, impossibly, he did. The exact words spoken in that submarine are lost to history. The Soviet Navy didn't exactly keep detailed records of moments when they almost started nuclear war. But we know the result. Savitsky agreed to surface. The torpedo remained in its tube. The world lived. At 9 p.m. on October 27th, submarine B-59 surfaced in the middle of the American fleet. Imagine the scene from the American perspective. They've been dropping depth charges on this submarine for hours, trying to force it to surface. They know it's Soviet. They have no idea it's carrying a nuclear weapon. And suddenly, this dark shape breaches the surface, water cascading off its hull. Sailors on the American destroyers scramble to battle stations. Nobody knows what's about to happen. On the deck of B-59, the conning tower hatch opens. Soviet sailors emerge, squinting in the bright searchlights. They look like ghosts, pale, emaciated, staggering. Some collapse on the deck. The heat and CO2 poisoning has devastated them. The American ships surround the submarine, but don't fire. There's a tense standoff. Nobody wants to be the one who starts World War III over a misunderstanding. The Soviets run their diesel engines, they recharge batteries, they gulp fresh air. The crew starts to recover. And they establish radio contact with Moscow. Here's what they learned. The war hadn't started. The crisis was still ongoing, but both sides were negotiating. The depth charges were signals, not attacks. They were supposed to surface for identification and then proceed to Cuba on the surface as per the quarantine agreement. Nobody ordered them to launch any weapons. Captain Savitsky must have felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He'd been seconds away from launching a nuclear torpedo based on a misunderstanding. But there's something else that became clear. If that torpedo had launched, it would have been interpreted as a deliberate Soviet first strike. Kennedy would have been under enormous pressure to retaliate. The missiles in Cuba would have been launched. The U.S. would have responded with their entire arsenal. Game theory strategists had predicted exactly this kind of scenario. Two sides, both rational actors, both trying to avoid war, but a mistake or miscommunication triggering a catastrophic escalation neither side wanted. Herman Kahn, the nuclear strategist who literally wrote the book on thermonuclear war, had a term for it. Escalation dominance failure. Once certain thresholds are crossed, even rational actors can't stop the momentum toward total war. The nuclear torpedo would have crossed that threshold. But it didn't, because of one man's refusal. The next day, October 28th, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis was officially over. B-59 and the other Soviet submarines were ordered back home. The crew of B-59 returned to their base expecting what? Medals? Recognition? Gratitude for their restraint? They got none of that. Instead, they were reprimanded. Savitsky was criticized for letting his submarine be detected. The flotilla commander, Arkhipov himself, was blamed for the failure of the mission. The fact that they'd nearly started World War III was an embarrassment to be buried, not a triumph to be celebrated. Arkhipov passed over for major promotions for years. He continued to serve in the Soviet Navy, eventually reaching the rank of Rear Admiral. But his career never achieved the heights it might have. Some of his colleagues resented him for the incident. Some thought he'd shown weakness. The Soviet government classified everything about the nuclear torpedo. The world had no idea how close it came to annihilation. Meanwhile, in America, the Cuban Missile Crisis became a symbol of Kennedy's strong leadership. We stood up to the Soviets. We forced them to blink. We won. Nobody knew that the actual closest moment to nuclear war wasn't in the negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev. It was in a decision made in a boiling hot submarine by a man whose name appeared in no newspaper headlines. For the next 40 years, Vasili Arkhipov lived a quiet life. He never spoke publicly about what happened on October 27, 1962. He couldn't. It was classified. He died from kidney cancer in 1998, likely related to his radiation exposure on K-19. He was 72 years old. His obituary made no mention of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It made no mention of his role in preventing World War III. To the world, he was just another retired Soviet Navy officer. So how did we find out? After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, archives started opening up. Documents were declassified. Veterans started talking about things they'd been forbidden to discuss for decades. In 2002, at a conference in Havana marking the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the full story of submarine B-59 finally came out. Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, was there. He later said, "The lesson from this is that a guy called Vasili Arkhipov saved the world." American participants at the conference were stunned. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, had no idea about the nuclear torpedoes. When he learned that Soviet submarine commanders had the authority to launch nuclear weapons independently, he was shaken. Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's advisor and historian, said, "This was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history." Imagine being in that conference room in 2002, learning for the first time that you'd been minutes away from nuclear annihilation 40 years earlier. That the survival of civilization had depended on the courage of one man to say no. Rurik Ketov, the commander of another submarine in the flotilla, confirmed the story. He revealed that all 4 submarines had nuclear torpedoes. All 4 were being depth-charged by American forces. All 4 commanders faced the same decision as Savitsky. The difference? Arkhipov was only on B-59. The other submarines had to make the call with just 2 senior officers. We got incredibly lucky that the Americans chose to depth-charge B-59 instead of one of the others. If they'd gone after a different submarine, there would have been no third voice urging restraint. Vadim Orlov, another officer from B-59, later wrote about that day. He described the heat, the fear, the certainty that war had started. He wrote about Archipov's calmness in the face of chaos, his refusal to give in to panic. In 2017, Orlov said, "It felt like you were sitting in a metal barrel, which somebody is constantly blasting with a sledgehammer." He described the moment when Savitsky was ready to launch. The captain lost his temper and ordered the nuclear torpedo to be prepared for battle. He said, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all." And then, Arkhipov stepped in. Orlov remembered Archipov's argument. They had no orders, they had no confirmation war had started. Launching would doom not just themselves, but potentially the world. He said, he was a man who knew his duty, but he also knew his humanity. Here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Arkhipov wasn't exceptional in terms of his training or intelligence. He wasn't a maverick or a rebel. He was a by-the-book Soviet officer who believed in the chain of command and following orders. But he learned from K-19 that panic leads to worse outcomes than patience. He had learned that in extreme situations, the instinct to act can be more dangerous than the discipline to wait. And he learned to question whether what seems obvious in the moment is actually true. Think about the assumptions everyone on B-59 was making. We're under attack, therefore war has started, therefore we must fight back. Each step seems logical. The conclusion seems inevitable. But Arkhipov challenged the first assumption. Are we actually under attack, or are we being signaled? Do we know for certain, or are we guessing based on incomplete information? This is the same cognitive error that nearly caused nuclear war multiple times during the Cold War. In 1979, a training tape was accidentally loaded into NORAD's computers, showing a massive Soviet missile launch. For 6 minutes, American forces prepared for retaliation before someone realized it was a mistake. In 1983, Soviet early warning systems detected 5 American ICBMs launching. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, decided it was a false alarm and didn't report it up the chain of command. He was right. It was sunlight reflecting off clouds. If he'd followed protocol, the Soviets might have launched in response. These moments keep happening. They keep almost killing us, and they keep being stopped by individuals who refuse to trust the system when the system is screaming at them to start a war. Arkhipov was the first. He set the pattern. But let's talk about the thing that haunts me about this story. How easily it could have gone the other way. If Arkhipov had been on a different submarine that day, B-59 probably launches that torpedo. 2 officers would have said yes, and there would have been no third voice urging caution. If Arkhipov had not served on K-19, if he hadn't learned the lesson about panic versus patience, maybe he agrees with Savitsky. Maybe he thinks the captain knows best. If the Soviet Navy had different protocols, if they'd required only 2 officers to authorize a nuclear launch instead of 3, it wouldn't have mattered what Arkhipov thought. If the Americans had depth-charged B-59 just a little harder, if they'd actually damaged the submarine, maybe Savitsky convinces Arkhipov they really are under attack. There are a dozen decision points where this goes the other way, a dozen moments where a slight change in circumstance leads to the launch. And if that torpedo launches, here's what happens. The USS Randolph and several destroyers are vaporized. Thousands of American sailors die instantly. The shockwave and radiation kill thousands more on nearby ships. Kennedy is woken up with the news that a Soviet submarine has nuked the American fleet. His advisors are screaming for retaliation. The Joint Chiefs are implementing SIOP, Sack bombers are taking off, missile silos are opening. In Moscow, Khrushchev learns that an American carrier group has been destroyed. He assumes the Americans have attacked first, just like his hardliners predicted. Soviet missiles in Cuba receive launch orders. Soviet ICBMs are fueled. In Cuba, the R-12 missiles launch. Washington, New York, and other cities are hit. 60 million Americans die in the first hour. The U.S. retaliates with everything. Soviet cities are erased. 100 million Soviets die in the first hour. The Soviets launch everything they have left. Europe is destroyed, Asia is destroyed. The nuclear arsenals of both superpowers are emptied into each other's heartlands. By the end of the first day, 300 million people are dead, but that's just the beginning. The fires from burning cities lift enough smoke and ash into the atmosphere to block the sun, temperatures drop globally, crops fail, billions face starvation. Nuclear winter lasts for years, civilization collapses, most of humanity dies over the following decade. The survivors inherit a poisoned, frozen world. This isn't speculation, this is what the actual military and scientific studies predicted would happen. Carl Sagan and other scientists calculated the nuclear winter effect. Military strategists on both sides knew their war plans would lead to exactly this outcome. They built the weapons anyway, they targeted the cities anyway, they maintained the hair trigger alert systems anyway. And on October 27, 1962, for reasons that have nothing to do with any government's wisdom or planning, we didn't pull the trigger. One man, one decision. 7 billion people who would never exist got the chance to be born because Vasili Arkhipov said no. So what do we do with this story? I think there are a few lessons here that go beyond just nuclear weapons are bad or war is terrible. Those things are true, but they're also obvious. The first lesson is about the fragility of everything. We live in a world that exists because of a handful of moments where someone chose restraint over retaliation. Our continued existence isn't guaranteed by systems or treaties or rationality. It's guaranteed by individuals making correct choices in impossible situations. And those individuals were just people. Arkhipov wasn't a superhero. Petrov wasn't a genius. They were normal people in extraordinary circumstances who happened to make the right call, which means our survival depends on luck, on the right person being in the right place, on someone having learned the right lessons from previous experiences, on chance. That should terrify you, but it should also inspire you, because it means individuals matter. Your decisions matter. When systems are broken, when institutions are failing, when everyone around you is panicking and demanding action, you have the ability to say, wait, let's think about this. The second lesson is about questioning assumptions. Everyone on B-59 assumed they knew what was happening. The evidence seemed clear, the conclusions seemed obvious, but they were wrong. How many times in your life are you absolutely certain about something based on incomplete information? How many times do you make decisions based on assumptions that feel like facts but are really just guesses? Arkhipov's genius was recognizing that we're under attack was an interpretation, not a fact. It felt like a fact because of the circumstances, but it was still just a theory that could be tested. How different would the world be if more people had that instinct? To pause before accepting what seems obvious, to ask what else could this be before committing to a course of action. The third lesson is about who gets remembered. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as a triumph of Kennedy's diplomacy. And maybe it was. Kennedy and Khrushchev did successfully navigate a crisis that could have ended civilization. But the person who most directly prevented nuclear war wasn't a president or a premier. He was a second-in-command officer on a submarine who nobody knew about for 40 years. History doesn't remember the right heroes. It remembers the visible ones, the ones who give speeches and sign treaties and appear in photographs. The person who actually saved the world died unknown. His family had no idea what he'd done. His country never thanked him. He got no ticker tape parade, no presidential medal, no place in the history books. He just went back to his job and lived a quiet life and died of cancer probably caused by his previous service preventing a different nuclear disaster. There's something profound and disturbing about that. The most important decision in human history was made by someone history didn't care about. Makes you wonder how many other crucial moments are out there, forgotten or classified or simply never written down. How many other people saved the world in ways we'll never know about? I started this video by telling you that one man stopped World War III, but that's not quite right. What Vasili Arkhipov really did was refuse to start it. There's a difference. Stopping something implies you're preventing an inevitable process. But nuclear war isn't inevitable. It's a choice. It requires someone to give an order, someone to turn a key, someone to press a button. Arkhipov didn't stop the war. He refused to choose it. That distinction matters because it means we're not victims of some unstoppable historical force. Nuclear war isn't something that happens to us. It's something we would do to ourselves. And if we can choose to start it, we can choose not to. Right now, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons. The United States and Russia still maintain thousands of warheads on alert status, ready to launch within minutes. The nuclear football follows the president everywhere, containing the codes to end civilization. We've added new nuclear powers since the Cold War: India, Pakistan, North Korea. We've had new close calls: the Kashmir crisis, the Norwegian rocket incident, various false alarms that didn't make headlines. The weapons still exist. The targeting plans still exist. The same insane logic of mutually assured destruction still governs strategic thinking. We act like we solved this problem because we survived the Cold War, but we didn't solve anything. We just got lucky a handful of times. The problem is still there, waiting for the moment when the person in Arkipov's position makes a different choice. And that's the final lesson. We can't depend on luck forever. Every year we maintain these weapons is another year we're gambling that the next crisis will have another Arkhipov, that the next false alarm will have another Petrov, that the next close call will be de-escalated by someone choosing restraint over retaliation. Eventually, statistically, we're going to lose that bet. Unless we decide to remove the option entirely. Unless we choose disarmament. Unless we decide that having the power to end civilization isn't actually making us safer. I don't know if that will happen. The political obstacles are enormous. The strategic calculations are complex. The distrust between nuclear powers is deep. But I know this. Vasili Arkhipov proved that one person can make a difference. In the most extreme circumstances imaginable, under the worst pressure possible, one person's choice mattered. If one person can prevent a war that would kill hundreds of millions, imagine what millions of people could accomplish if they demanded an end to the systems that make such wars possible. Arkhipov died in 2008, 24 years ago. He never knew he'd become famous. He never knew historians would call him the man who saved the world. He never saw the articles and books and documentaries about October 27, 1962. But his wife, Olga, lived to see his recognition. In 2002, when the story came out, she said he always knew he'd done the right thing. He never regretted it. She said he had nightmares about Kate-19 for years, about the men who went into the reactor, about the decisions made under pressure with incomplete information. Maybe those nightmares saved us. Maybe the memory of what happens when things go wrong kept him calm when everyone else was ready to launch. In 2002, the Future of Life Institute gave Arkhipov a posthumous award. It's not much. A small recognition from a nonprofit organization that most people have never heard of. But the award included this citation: for his courage and fidelity to humanity. Fidelity to humanity. That's what it comes down to, isn't it? Not fidelity to your nation or your ideology or your orders. Fidelity to the human species. The recognition that ending civilization is worse than disobeying your captain, that survival is more important than victory. Arkhipov embodied that principle in a moment when it mattered most. And because he did, you're alive to hear this story. Your parents were born. Your children might be born. every person you've ever met exists because a Soviet submarine officer you'd never heard of refused to kill them. I want you to think about something as we close this out. Right now, somewhere, there's probably someone in position of power facing a difficult decision. Maybe it's a military officer, maybe it's a politician, maybe it's someone operating some system we don't even know about. They're under pressure, they're scared. They're being told to do something that feels necessary but carries enormous risk. And they're trying to decide whether to say yes or no. The systems we've built, political, military, technological, are designed to work automatically. They're designed to reduce human decision-making. They want quick responses, decisive action, immediate retaliation. But sometimes the right decision is to interrupt the system, to say, wait, let me think about this. Let me make sure we're not about to make an irreversible mistake based on incomplete information. That's hard. It requires courage. It requires being willing to be wrong. It requires accepting that you might be the only person questioning what everyone else thinks is obvious. But it's necessary. Because the systems we built are capable of destroying us, and they will destroy us unless individuals keep choosing not to let them. So maybe the lesson of Vasili Arkhipov isn't just about nuclear weapons. Maybe it's about any situation where systems and pressure and fear are pushing us toward a decision we can't take back. Maybe it's about climate change, where we keep choosing short-term gains over long-term survival. Maybe it's about artificial intelligence, where we keep building capabilities without fully understanding the risks. Maybe it's about the next crisis we haven't thought of yet, where someone will face the same choice Arkhipov faced. Follow the logic that seems obvious, or question whether that logic is based on truth. We don't know who that person will be. We don't know if they'll make the right choice, but we know it's possible. Because on October 27th, 1962, one man proved that even when every circumstance is pushing you toward catastrophe, you can choose differently. You can say no. And that one word can save the world. Vasili Alexandrovich Arkhipov. Remember that name. He saved your life. You never knew him. He never knew you. He had no idea when he made his decision that 70 years later, people would still be alive because of it. He was just doing his job, thinking clearly, refusing to panic, choosing the harder path. And because he did, we're here. All of us. Everyone you love. Everyone you'll ever meet. We're all living in the reality that exists because one man refused to end it. No statues, no holidays, no place on currency or monuments. Just a name that should be remembered as long as humans tell stories about how close we came to extinction and how we survived. Thank you, Vasili Arkhipov. We owe you everything.